Well, hi everyone. Just a quick presentation here on trauma in a time of trauma and looking at the times we're in and how that's exacerbated many people's symptoms of anxiety or stress. And just to tell you that this is not surprising, actually, when you understand that we are biopsychosocial creatures. We tend to think of ourselves as biological machines. That's the way medicine has tended to view us, but actually we're more than that. We're designed to connect with other people or even animals because our nervous systems are wired with mirror neurons. They're a form of neuron that exists in the brain to recognize and respond to other people's emotions, especially when those emotions threaten our safety. So perception of anger or imminent, distress in another can actually trigger the same emotion in us. So fear and panic are very contagious, actually. And I've been saying right from the beginning that we've been in a time of great, that's been the fear pandemic, really. And although we're coming out of it now, to some extent, there's still an awful lot of fear around, and it's creating havoc with our nervous systems and also with, I would say, public policy as well, which is being very geared towards fear and threat. So if you remember, maybe you've come across this before, or if you haven't, this is new. This is Polyvagal Theory. In fact, the human nervous system has 3 levels of reaction to threat. And it's hierarchical. So it starts, number 1, if you're under threat, you will seek connection. So if you see this in children, if they hurt themselves or they feel afraid, usually they'll reach their arms up when they're very young. It's very obvious when they're young, not so obvious when they're a teenager, but sometimes they're lacked out, but what they really need is connection. And this is a social engagement system. It's a form of the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is a really important nerve that runs from the back part of your brain, your threat center, all the way down the center of your body into the various organs. So it's part of your bodily control system, actually. It connects to your heart rate, your breathing, your bladder, kidneys, virtually every organ is connected via the vagus nerve. The only one that isn't is your adrenal glands, which is interesting. And that's because it's part of the next system. The adrenals are part of your fight and flight system, which is the next level. If connection doesn't work, if somebody isn't there for you, if they turn away from you, if it's simply not safe, you don't perceive safety, you will go into the next level, which is fight and flight. Now, that works in some cases, if you've got something you can run away from or something you can fight, but there are so many instances in human existence, particularly when we're young, where we can't. Say we're the parents are our source of threat, or our sibling, or school, which we're forced to go to for most of us. In adulthood, if you're in a bad relationship, it's difficult and very hard, particularly if you have children, to leave, to flee. And it may not be the appropriate reaction, but it's just the way we get terribly stuck. And if that continues, if these senses of these threat signals continue, then we tend to go down into the final level system, and it's freeze or fawn, and it's part of our reptilian survival system because it comes from a reptilian brain area right at the back, our brain stem, which does connect to the vagus nerve, but in a very different way to the social connection, because this part of the vagus is very slow indeed. It's what we call unmyelinated, which means it doesn't have its kind of insulation sheath, fatty sheath that goes along the nerve, which makes impulses travel very much faster. So it's part of your slow reptilian parasympathetic system, and that is really a difficult place to be. And a lot of us have been in that in the last few years, whether by what's been happening in society, with the pandemic, or even before that through threats of chronic illness, difficulties with, job losses, financial threats, and so on. There's so many ways that these threats can put us into this low-level system. And of course, the balance between all of these, between freeze and flight and fawn and fight, are thinking about it as a sort of gauge with a needle that moves between, because it's not like we always stay in one or other of these levels. We're constantly moving between them, but people often get stuck in levels 2 and 3. So often not really having a safe feeling with social connection. And so it's the balance really between being and doing, listening and talking, how you feel in life, how you respond to life, that determines your mental and physical health, because these things are feedback. They have a feedback system. So it's not a one-way street. How you feel in your body actually feeds back to your brain and tells you how you are. And so threat can get very deeply embedded as a habit or as a conditioned response. And of course, we've had various effects of the media and government policy, which have been kind of making this a subtle message in, constant 24-hour messaging of threat. And so this innate desire for human contact, that level 1 that we saw, is being systematically denied by the fear stoking of the media, which thrives on it. That's what it's there for, to tell you bad news most of the time. You rarely see good news in the media. Even now, thinking about it, winter storms have become, now that they name them here in the UK, we get fear stoking of each storm as it comes in. Well, we used to just accept winter storms were a normal thing, and we didn't anticipate them, and we weren't able to follow them in quite the degree we are now with weather apps and so on. So we have this fear stoking, and it's part and parcel of normal life now, and the threat of scarcity. So when we see events in the world that are likely to create scarcity because there's a threat of invasion, say, we are fearful all the time, and the sense of separation from each other allows no release for that, because we feel isolated. And so lack of support, it creates a sense of aloneness. We're alone with our feelings, we're alone with our fears, with no predictability. Now, the brain really likes predictability. It really likes to know that what's coming up, and it likes to know that we are sharing that with other people. And so this sense of shared responsibility, if I do this bit, you can do this bit. So we can pass over some of our fears and then have people take care of us a bit. And that should be done, of course, by government and the bodies that they kind of work with, but that's not happening. And recently we've seen government actually debasing that to some extent, with not doing what they're saying to other people. So that's been a problem. We often feel alone with our stress, with our distress, in fact, and a sense of overwhelm, which of course is the definition of trauma. If we have nobody to share it with, it becomes traumatic, because we can't release the energy that's stored in that moment within our bodies. The sense of need to escape is a stored energy. Animals tend to do a lot better with this than we do. They tend to be able to shake or run, but we tend to not do that. We tend to control our responses and direct our fear and emotions inwards. And if others are becoming a source of threat, because this was promoted largely by the way it was discussed, the way COVID was kind of framed, was that other people might carry it even if they don't have symptoms. So the idea of asymptomatic spread. So others are becoming a source of threat. But you could equally say that's true with any virus or any condition really, which is invisible and does seem to create a threat to our safety. So any form of contagion is a source of threat. And it's unfortunately, because of the way it's put and the way it's promoted, it distorts the reality of safety and threat perception. I mean, to give you an example, driving a car is a very dangerous activity. If you look statistically compared to, say, getting a virus, getting in a car is a very unsafe act, but we are not being shown countdowns of people who've been injured or died in car accidents daily. So we're not aware of it. And so our threat perception of that is very, very low. And so our safety perception is relatively high, and we tend to think nothing of getting in our car and going to the shops and so on. But that's not been true of this situation of the pandemic. And we've seen, therefore, this constant awareness, which is what we call hyper-vigilance. So you're always being on the lookout for threat, what's going on in the environment. And that tends to lead over time to a sense of free-floating anxiety. Now, that's all especially true of highly sensitive people. Highly sensitive people, which, by the way, is a category. It's about 20% of people. It's not something I've invented. And it depends largely on your genetics, what you inherit from your mum and dad in terms of certain groups of genes which control your stress response can predispose you to high anxiety at a low threshold. But of course, that depends very much on your environment and what turns these genes on and off. And that's what we call epigenetics. And so there is a basis in your biology as well, which may predispose you to this. And of course, we've been told, in the early stages to stay home, but if home is not a safe place, then we are in even greater danger than going out into the world. And so there's no respite from this threat sense. We've seen massive amounts early on anyway of domestic violence during lockdown. And more recently, I think we've seen a lot of isolation and self-harm, particularly in young people. There's no respite. That's the problem. And if it's happening everywhere at the same time, there's nowhere to go where you can escape. And that's been largely stoked, however, by the media, who have been giving us this constant message. And particularly if our livelihoods, our work is threatened as well for various reasons, not just to do with the pandemic, but scarcity, shortages and so on, and in particular, more recently, even the vaccine mandates. So these are all likely to create a divisiveness in society between those of us who can work from home, those of us who can't, those of us who had the vaccine, those of us who haven't, and mandates kind of embed that, really. They make it kind of a moral choice, a responsibility for everybody, which is linked to your income, with your ability to live. And so it becomes a very, very difficult one for people to negotiate. Now, compassion should be the antidote to trauma. All right, and generally is regarded that way. And compassion is really about becoming aware of your vulnerability, your own innate sensitivities and vulnerabilities, and the fact that you're human and the way you're feeling is okay. And showing that to others as well, compassion to others. I understand how you're feeling and it might be different to me, but I get it. I feel for you. That's what compassion is. It's very much linked to empathy, really. But it's very difficult if you're being impacted by other people's behavior. And that's where we lose compassion, because suddenly what you do is affecting me. And I'm getting angry about that, and I'm getting threatened by it, and I'm getting very hyper aroused by it, and I'm going to attack you and defend myself. And so as things have gone on, we've seen less and less compassion and more attacking. And so trauma in a time of trauma, you see, when our experience of past trauma, and many of us have had experiences of trauma, or let's say emotional overwhelm, because sometimes trauma is a difficult word for many people. It was for me. Emotional overwhelm is perhaps a better way of putting it. It's something, because trauma is anything that overwhelms you. If you've had any experiences like that, and most of us have, let's be honest, particularly when we were young, we can easily be tipped over the edge. Our nervous system can become easily tipped by current experiences. So they tend to combine in this, you know, double or triple whammy of what happened then and how we felt then, and then how we feel now. And we're seeing a lot of mental health crises because of this. You know, just this tipping point is reached, and suddenly we're into a state of either complete dissociation, apathy, hopelessness, or we're triggered into the kind of mobilization of attacking other people and you know, fighting. And if our culture is traumatized too, which I believe it is, to be honest, I think we're in a traumatic time, then there is no one to help support us or take this pain away. And we lose our faith in ourselves, in our innate goodness. Now, what I mean by goodness isn't being good. It's I am good. I deserve to be here. I have validity. I am enough. And we believe that we're somehow broken, at fault, destroyed in some way. That's a shame story, by the way. That's another talk, but you don't feel ashamed exactly. You feel like you're not enough, and that's a shame imprint. So it's not about what you do, it's about who you are. And our culture is based on this separation and fear, and has been long before COVID came along. We were seeing this, but it's really exacerbated it. And it inculcates, brings in a tremendous amount of suffering. Suffering is about resistance to what is. And suffering is, I think, a very uniquely human experience, actually, because we overlay our beliefs about what is happening on top of what is actually happening. And so suffering is an inside job, if you like. It's what we believe about ourselves while we're going through a certain experience. So if we're resisting what's going on in our lives, that's where we create suffering. And a sense of we don't belong, you know, a lack of belonging is massive, or has been for many people, even those who've actually enjoyed the reset, you know, going back home to work and maybe changing jobs, maybe moving home, a sense of where do I belong, which is so important for human beings. We need to know where we belong. But it's especially true of the young, you know, people coming from childhood into adolescence and young adulthood need to know where they belong. It's a natural part of feeling safe and connected in the place you work, or your friendship groups, or your tribe, let's say, you know, your family or your friends. And without it, we feel adrift. And we are seeing, of course, a surge in anxiety amongst the young teenagers, especially needing social connection, and girls more than boys. Some sensitive males as well, but girls they're wired to cooperate, to connect, so their brains are wired a bit differently to boys. And so we're seeing a lot of self-harming and mental health disorders, exponential increases in both the US, the UK, and I dare say in many other Western nations. But the good news is that you can change this, you can rewire, you can reconnect, but it has to have a sense of interconnectedness with our communities, with other people, with people that care about us, who see us, who feel us, who hear us, that we get the sense that we are enough. And actually it can be connection with animals, it can be connection with the natural world, but whatever it is, it has to be connection with something alive, something living, something that nurtures us. And many people have many different ways of doing that. But we have to make an effort now to get out more and remove the habit of staying isolated, which has become, for some people, it's become a source of safety, you know, just to be on their own at home, and actually going back into the world has become more threatening. So this habit, this conditioned response of staying at home or in isolation, which was necessary, well, at least from the conventional view, it was necessary at the beginning to stop the spread. It wasn't done very well, and you know, we can all look back and say it could have been done a lot better. But that first response has become perpetuated as we've gone on, and it can get very dysfunctional, and it just continues. And we're seeing that, you know, the self-perpetuating fear, where many people are continuing to mask. They prefer to, even when restrictions are lifted, or going back to their workplaces or colleges. They find that very threatening, because it takes away the perception of safety that they had from being alone or at home. And so risk aversion, which wasn't an invention of the pandemic, it was coming in from very, very many different parts of our culture. Health and safety, you know, that kind of notion that we have to account for every possible thing when we set anything up, has become the norm, but it becomes the norm much more so when we lack social connection, when we feel alone. And so the learnings really for me, this is just a personal reflection, about what the COVID pandemic has taught us, is to value each other much more, our friendships, the time in nature, any form of connection beyond the thinking and planning and executive functioning that we've all relied on, you know, the endless to-do lists. Just being has become much more important to me, and actually has made me reevaluate my life in many ways, my work-life balance particularly. And another thing that came up for me was to prioritize doing something we love over the duty I should, I ought to, I must, you know, rather than no, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm deciding to change job, change relationship, move house, actually be in my life in a more authentic way. And so that's definitely happened for me. And the final thing is that human life is ultimately of great importance and is valuable, but learning that we're not immortal, and that in prioritizing that belief, this fear of death that must be avoided at all costs, has created a huge distortion from looking after our children, who are our future, towards looking after the very old. And, you know, I've just lost, you know, an elderly mother, so I'm not pretending that any loss is nothing. It's hugely sad. But when someone is old, we have to expect they're going to die. And truly, I'm going to die at some point. Everyone's going to die. We have to understand that. We have become disconnected from our mortality, and the fact that, you know, we are part of nature, and that what we're doing to the natural world is actually driving a lot of what we're seeing. You know, the destruction of the environment has created this huge push for genetic adaptation. And so we're seeing a lot of that driving these variants, for instance. So I think it's important to understand that all life is valuable, all life, not just human life, and see us as part of the bigger picture. And I really value the work of Dr. Zach Bush on this, who's done a lot of uplifting and ultimately visionary work on this, which I would recommend you have a look at. My final lesson is that compassion isn't easy. All right, that we can all talk about compassion, but it's actually a practice that many of us struggle with, particularly if you become a source of threat to me because you disagree with me. So I have struggled with that a lot, even though I know it's such an important part of what will move us forward. And I wonder, what have your learnings been? And that's a question I'll leave you with. Do get in touch. Do join the community membership if you're interested, where we will be discussing things like this. I've got an ongoing pay-as-you-go membership available, £9.99 per session. That's less than 3 cups of coffee, once a month, planned monthly on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. GMT, and we will see if there'll be another session or an alternative, maybe at lunchtimes for people for whom that doesn't work. We'll be dealing with different topics each time, all around the theme of emotional healing, and trauma, big T and small t trauma, little things and big things that kind of combine anything that overwhelmed you, and how we can heal these imprints and recover our sense of self. Now, anyone can join. If you'd like them to sign up, you go to my website, which is there. And also you can email me at that, patriciaworby@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to show you how to join us. It'd be so good. Final note, the emotional audit program restarts April the 21st, but there's going to be several ongoing webinars and Facebook Lives before then to whet the appetite of anyone interested in learning how to thrive. So thank you for listening. Take care, everybody, and bye for now.